In the autumn of 1874, the Norwegian immigrant settlements of Duluth, Minnesota, spoke in hushed whispers about 12-year-old Astrid Larsen, a frail child with piercing blue eyes who possessed an unsettling gift. She could determine the exact number of heartbeats remaining in a person's life, memorize complex conversations after hearing them once, and calculate precise distances between buildings simply by observing shadows. What modern medicine might classify as an extraordinary neurological phenomenon was, to the Lutheran community of 1874, either a divine miracle or something far more sinister. But when Astrid began using her remarkable abilities to expose hidden corruption, predict tragic mining accidents, and reveal intimate details of crimes thought buried forever, the community's wonder transformed into terror. By winter's end, 4 men would perish under mysterious circumstances, 2 families would vanish in the dead of night, and Astrid Larsen herself would disappear without explanation, leaving behind only a wooden box filled with calculations that no one dared decipher. Before we delve deeper into the chilling account of Astrid Larsen and the dark truths her extraordinary mind revealed in Duluth's Norwegian quarter, make sure to subscribe to the Holloway archives and activate that notification bell. We deliver the most haunting historical mysteries weekly, and let us know in the comments which state or region you're listening from. These stories unfolded in communities remarkably similar to yours, closer to home than you might imagine. What the residents of Iron Point didn't comprehend was that Astrid's gift would uncover a network of deception, betrayal, and murder that had been carefully concealed for nearly a decade, and that her mathematical precision would become their community's most terrifying nightmare. Duluth's Norwegian quarter in 1874 was a thriving enclave of timber-framed houses, busy iron mines, and the constant mixture of Norwegian voices blending with English in the crisp Minnesota air. The community of approximately 6,000 Norwegian immigrants had established their own little Bergen along the shores of Lake Superior, complete with traditional meeting halls, Lutheran churches, and the familiar rhythms of Old World customs transplanted to American territory. The men labored in the iron mines, Mesabi range operations, and the countless smaller ventures that made Duluth prosperous, while their wives cultivated gardens that produced the same crops their ancestors had grown in the fjords of Norway. Lars and Ingrid Larsen had arrived from Trondheim in 1862 with aspirations of wealth and their infant daughter, Astrid. Lars secured steady employment as a mine foreman at the Anderson Mining Company, a medium-sized operation that extracted iron ore for the expanding nation's hungry steel mills. Ingrid accepted sewing and alterations to supplement their earnings, her skilled hands working by lamplight long after Astrid had been tucked into bed in their modest but immaculate home on Bergen Street. The Larsens were unremarkable in every aspect except for their daughter. Astrid had been born during the treacherous Atlantic voyage, 4 weeks premature and so delicate that the ship's physician predicted she wouldn't survive the crossing. But survive she did, though she remained petite and pale with enormous blue eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her with disturbing intensity. As a toddler, she seldom wept or sought attention, content to sit silently in corners, observing and listening as the adult world unfolded before her. By age 5, Astrid's parents began noticing something extraordinary. She could repeat entire conversations she had overheard days previously, complete with the exact intonations and accents of the speakers. She counted everything obsessively. The number of stitches in her mother's needlework, the steps from their front door to the general store, the precise interval between the mine whistles that marked the beginning and conclusion of each shift. When Lars taught her basic mathematics, she absorbed numerical concepts with frightening velocity, solving problems mentally faster than he could calculate them on paper. The Norwegian community initially regarded Astrid's abilities with a combination of pride and uneasiness. Old Mrs. Anderson, who claimed to remember the witch trials from her grandmother's tales, made the sign of the cross whenever Astrid's calculating blue eyes focused upon her. But Pastor Olsen, the robust Norwegian minister who served their small Lutheran congregation, proclaimed Astrid's gifts to be a blessing from the Almighty, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their new world community. The winter of 1873 had been particularly severe, with temperatures plummeting so low that Lake Superior developed ice formations for the first time in decades. The mine workers huddled around wood stoves, their breath visible even indoors, while their wives struggled to keep their families warm and nourished through the long, harsh months. It was during this isolated winter that Astrid's abilities began to assume a darker character, though no one yet understood what was approaching. Astrid had developed the practice of sitting beside the small window in their parlor, observing the neighbors conduct their daily activities with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems. She began to recognize patterns, not merely in numbers, but in human conduct. Mr. Johansen always walked to the mine following the same route, taking exactly 312 steps, except on Thursdays when he took a different path, requiring 367 steps. Erickson hung her washing in a specific sequence, but when her husband worked late shifts at the smelter, she altered the arrangement completely. These observations might have been dismissed as the peculiarities of an unusual child, except that Astrid began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. The transformation from curiosity to dread commenced on a gray January morning in 1874. Astrid was sitting at the kitchen table, methodically consuming her breakfast while her mother prepared her father's lunch pail, when she suddenly looked up and declared, "Mr. Gustafson will not return from the mine today. He will die at exactly 16 minutes past 11 o'clock. Ingrid nearly dropped the metal container she was holding. "Astrid, dear Lord, what a dreadful thing to say. Why would you think such a thing?" Astrid's blue eyes remained fixed on her mother's face with that unsettling intensity. "He has been consuming medicine from the small green bottle for 19 days. Yesterday, he consumed 4 times more than usual. His gait was irregular, 276 steps instead of his normal 312. When people alter their patterns by more than 15%, something significant occurs within 48 hours. Mr. Gustafson's pattern changed by 18%. The calculation is straightforward." Lars, who had been donning his heavy woolen coat, halted and stared at his daughter. Eric Gustafson was indeed known to drink heavily, but no more than half the men in the Norwegian quarter. The notion that Astrid had been counting his steps and monitoring his drinking habits was disturbing enough, but her calm, mathematical certainty about his death sent a chill through both parents that had nothing to do with the Minnesota winter. "You must not speak of such things, Astrid," Lars said firmly. "It is not appropriate for a child to discuss death." Astrid simply nodded and returned to her breakfast, but her parents exchanged worried glances over her bowed head. They had grown accustomed to their daughter's unusual observations, but this felt different, darker, and more specific than her typical mathematical pronouncements. At precisely 16 minutes past 11 that morning, Eric Gustafson collapsed in the mine's sorting room. The official cause of death was determined by Dr. Hansen to be liver failure, brought on by chronic alcohol poisoning. The mine workers who discovered him noted that he had been behaving strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily than usual and displaying signs of severe distress. But what truly unsettled them was the timing. Astrid Larsen's prediction had been accurate to the minute. Word of Astrid's grim prophecy spread through the Norwegian quarter like smoke from a cabin fire. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others remembered the pale girl with the calculating eyes and began to wonder what else she might have observed during her silent vigils at the parlor window. The Larsen family found themselves the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances when they walked to church or visited the market. Pastor Olsen, who had previously praised Astrid's gifts as divine, now seemed less certain. When Lars approached him after Sunday service, seeking guidance about his daughter's disturbing prediction, the minister's jovial demeanor had been replaced by something approaching concern. "Lars, my friend," Pastor Olsen said, his Norwegian accent thick with worry, "perhaps it would be best if young Astrid spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her scripture studies. The Lord grants us gifts, yes, but sometimes the enemy can corrupt even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." This suggestion troubled Lars deeply. He had always been a practical man, more concerned with the science of metallurgy through the mysteries of faith. But even he could not dismiss the unsettling accuracy of Astrid's prediction. That evening, he sat his daughter down for a serious conversation. "Astrid, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Gustafsson?" Astrid looked at her father with those enormous blue eyes. Her expression as calm and analytical as always. "I observe, I count, I remember. Mr. Gustafsson's behavior changed in predictable ways. When someone increases their alcohol consumption by 43% over a 19-day period, while simultaneously reducing their food intake by approximately 25%, liver stress becomes inevitable. I calculated the most probable time of failure based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms." Lars felt his blood run cold. His 12-year-old daughter was speaking like a physician, or something far more troubling. "But Astrid, how could you know all these details about Mr. Gustafsson's eating and drinking?" "I observe everything, Papa. Every day, every person, every pattern." Astrid's voice remained matter-of-fact, but there was something in her eyes that made Lars deeply uncomfortable. "Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I've made?" Lars quickly shook his head. He did not want to know what else his daughter had calculated about their neighbors' lives and deaths. But as he tucked Astrid into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his family was standing at the edge of something much darker than a simple mathematical curiosity. The January snow continued to fall outside their small house, muffling the sounds of the Norwegian quarter and creating an insulated world where secrets could be hidden and observations could be made without detection. Astrid lay quietly in her narrow bed, her mathematical mind processing the day's data and calculating probabilities that no 12-year-old should be able to comprehend, and certainly no 12-year-old should want to know. In the weeks following Erik Gustafsson's death, the atmosphere in Duluth's Norwegian quarter shifted like the wind off Lake Superior. Astrid continued her daily observations, but now her parents watched her with growing unease as she sat by the parlor window, her blue eyes tracking the movements of their neighbors with mechanical precision. The child who had once been their pride had become a source of deep, gnawing worry. The mining community was tight-knit by necessity. The men relied on each other for work, their wives for companionship during the long winters, and their children played together in the narrow streets between the timber-framed buildings. But Astrid had never quite fit into this social fabric. While other children played games and told stories, she preferred to sit alone, counting and calculating and watching the world around her with that unsettling intensity. Ingrid began to notice that Astrid's observations were becoming more detailed and more disturbing. The child would mention casually that Mrs. Hansen had been meeting secretly with Mr. Anderson behind the mining office on Thursday afternoons for 8 weeks, or that the Peterson family had been burying something in their back garden every Monday after evening prayers. When Ingrid asked how Astrid could possibly know such things, the girl would simply explain that she had observed the patterns and calculated the probabilities. "People think they are being secret," Astrid said one February morning as she methodically spread butter on her bread. "But they follow patterns just like numbers. Mrs. Hansen always tells her husband she's visiting her cousin on Thursday afternoons, but she takes 143 steps to Mr. Anderson's office instead of 398 steps to her cousin's house. The Petersons bury objects wrapped in fabric exactly 81 centimeters apart in a grid pattern. They believe no one is watching, but I am always watching." Lars had heard enough. That evening, after Astrid was asleep, he spoke seriously with his wife about their daughter's increasingly troubling behavior. "Ingrid, this cannot continue. Astrid is becoming unnatural. Children should not observe such things, and they certainly should not speak of them so coldly." Ingrid nodded, her hands trembling as she mended one of Lars' work shirts. "I'm frightened, Lars. Not of Astrid, but of what people will think. Already the neighbors look at us strangely. Mrs. Anderson crossed the street yesterday when she saw me coming, and Pastor Olsen? He has not visited us since Eric's death." Their fears proved justified when 3 days later, Astrid made another of her mathematical announcements. She was helping her mother prepare dinner when she suddenly stopped peeling turnips and looked up with that familiar calculating expression. "Mrs. Hansen will be discovered tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Her husband will find her with Mr. Anderson in the mining office. There will be violence." Ingrid dropped her paring knife. "Astrid, no! You must not say such things." But Astrid continued with the same mathematical certainty she applied to her arithmetic lessons. "Mrs. Hansen has been arriving at the mining office 9 minutes earlier each week for 8 weeks. Mr. Anderson has been staying 41 minutes later each day. Tomorrow, Mr. Hansen will return from his ore delivery route 52 minutes early because his wagon wheel is developing structural weakness. I have observed the wobble increasing for 13 days. The convergence of these 3 variables makes discovery inevitable." Lars, who had been listening from the doorway, felt his chest tighten with dread. His daughter was not just observing their neighbors, she was predicting their futures with terrifying accuracy. "Astrid, how do you know about Mr. Hansen's wagon wheel?" "I count the rotation irregularities when it passes our house. On February 3rd, it wobbles every 17 rotations. Today, it was every 11 rotations. Tomorrow, the weakness will be severe enough to slow the delivery route by 52 minutes, causing Mr. Hansen to return early." The next day unfolded exactly as Astrid had calculated. Niels Hansen discovered his wife Kari in a compromising position with mining supervisor Gunnar Andersen. The confrontation that followed left Andersen with a fractured jaw and 4 broken ribs, while Kari was beaten so severely that Dr. Hansen had to be summoned. The scandal rocked the tight-knit Norwegian community, but what disturbed people even more was the growing realization that little Astrid Larsen had somehow predicted the entire sequence of events. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The pale girl with the mathematical mind had not only predicted Eridestison's death, but had also foreseen the Hansen-Andersen scandal with unsettling precision. People began to whisper about the strange child who sat at her window, watching and calculating and somehow knowing things that no child should know. The Larsen family found themselves increasingly isolated. Former friends avoided them at church, children were forbidden from playing near their house, and even the shopkeepers in the Norwegian quarter began to treat them with barely concealed suspicion. Lars's position at the mine became tenuous. His fellow workers viewed him with unease, and Gunnar Andersen, still recovering from his beating, made it clear that the Larsen family was no longer welcome at company social events. But Astrid seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision. She began keeping a wooden box filled with papers, covering the pages with numbers, dates, and observations that her parents dared not examine. The sight of their 12-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures, filled them with the dread they could not name. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened. The Norwegian quarter that had once felt like home now seemed hostile and threatening. Lars began to consider the unthinkable, leaving Duluth, abandoning the life they had built and starting over somewhere far from the whispers and the fear and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But Astrid was not finished with her calculations. The worst was yet to come, and her mathematical mind had already begun processing the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all. As March arrived in Duluth, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter, Astrid's collection of papers grew thicker with her precise notations. The wooden box had become her constant companion, and she filled its contents with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics. Her parents caught glimpses of charts tracking human behavior patterns, tables of numerical sequences they couldn't understand, and detailed maps of the Norwegian quarter marked with symbols and measurements. The community's fear of Astrid had begun to manifest in more concrete ways. His fellow workers viewed him with unease, and Gunnar Anderson, still recovering from his beating, made it clear that the Larsen family was no longer welcome at company social events. But Astrid seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision. She began keeping a wooden box filled with papers, covering the pages with numbers, dates, and observations that her parents dared not examine. The sight of their 12-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures, filled them with the dread they could not name. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened. The Norwegian quarter that had once felt like home now seemed hostile and threatening. Lars began to consider the unthinkable, leaving Duluth, abandoning the life they had built and starting over somewhere far from the whispers and the fear and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But Astrid was not finished with her calculations. The worst was yet to come, and her mathematical mind had already begun processing the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all. As March arrived in Duluth, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter, Astrid's collection of papers grew thicker with her precise notations. The wooden box had become her constant companion, and she filled its contents with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics. Her parents caught glimpses of charts tracking human behavior patterns, tables of numerical sequences they couldn't understand, and detailed maps of the Norwegian quarter marked with symbols and measurements. The community's fear of Astrid had begun to manifest in more concrete ways. Children were forbidden from walking past the Larsen house. Shopkeepers served the family quickly and without conversation, and even Pastor Olsen had begun limiting his interactions with them to formal church services. But Astrid's isolation only seemed to sharpen her observational skills, as if the removal of normal social distractions allowed her unusual mind to focus more intently on the mathematical patterns she perceived in human behavior. Dr. Christian Hansen, the community's physician, had grown increasingly curious about Astrid's abilities. Unlike the superstitious whispers of the neighbors, Dr. Hansen approached the situation with scientific interest. He had studied medicine in Oslo before emigrating to America and had encountered cases of unusual mental capabilities in his practice. When Lars Hansen approached him privately, seeking medical advice about his daughter's condition, Dr. Hansen agreed to examine Astrid. The examination took place on a rainy Thursday morning in Dr. Hansen's office above the apothecary on Superior Street. Astrid submitted to the doctor's questions and tests with the same mathematical precision she applied to everything else, answering each inquiry with detailed accuracy, while her blue eyes remained fixed on some invisible calculation. "Astrid," Dr. Hansen said in his accented English, "your father tells me you can predict when certain events will happen. Can you explain to me how you do this?" Astrid looked at the doctor with that unsettling intensity. "I observe patterns and calculate probabilities based on established behavioral data. People believe their actions are random, but they follow mathematical sequences. When I have sufficient data points, I can predict future behavior with high accuracy." Dr. Hansen leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Can you give me— How could you possibly know about a mine collapse?" Astrid consulted her papers. "Mr. Peterson has been using inferior timber supports for 14 days. I observe him purchasing substandard materials in quantities that exceed safety requirements. His wife departed for Bergen to visit her mother yesterday, which follows the pattern of wives leaving before significant industrial incidents occur. The mine shaft has structural instability that I calculated based on the vibration patterns and the frequency of dust emissions. The probability of collapse is 94%. Ingrid began to weep softly. The clinical way Astrid discussed potential tragedy, as if human suffering were simply another mathematical problem to be solved, frightened her more than any supernatural explanation would have. This was her child, but she no longer recognized the cold precision in Astrid's voice or the mechanical way she processed human pain. Lars made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to warn Olaf Peterson about Astrid's prediction, hoping that preventative action might save lives and perhaps demonstrate that his daughter's calculations could be used for good rather than simply predicting disaster. He found Peterson at the mining office Friday evening, reviewing safety reports and preparing for the next day's operations. Lars's warning was met with skeptical laughter and dismissive comments about the strange child who thinks she knows everything. But something in Lars's desperation must have penetrated Peterson's skepticism, because he promised to conduct additional safety inspections. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and a strong wind from the north. At exactly 9:23, the main support beam in the Peterson mine shaft gave way. The collapse trapped 4 men deep underground and caused structural damage that made immediate rescue impossible. Olaf Pettersson's body was found 6 hours later, crushed beneath the timber supports he had been trying to repair when the shaft collapsed. The accuracy of Astrid's prediction, down to the exact minute, sent shockwaves through the Norwegian quarter. Lars's attempt to warn Pettersson had been witnessed by several mine supervisors, and word spread quickly that Astrid had predicted not just the collapse, but its precise timing and consequences. The community's unease transformed into open fear, and the Larsen family found themselves completely ostracized. But for Astrid, the mine collapse was simply another data point to be recorded in her papers. She noted the correlation between her predictions and the actual event, made adjustments to her calculations based on the observed variables, and began processing new patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her prediction possible in the first place. The worst part was that she was not finished calculating. The days following the Pettersson mine collapse transformed the Norwegian quarter into a place of whispered fears and sideways glances. Astrid's prediction had been too precise, too detailed, and too accurate to be dismissed as coincidence. 4 families, the Hansens, the Johnsons, the Ericssons, and the Andersons, had lost their primary income sources due to the mine closure, and the community was struggling to support the displaced workers while trying to process the unsettling reality of Astrid's mathematical prophecies. Lars found his position at the remaining mines had become untenable. His fellow workers avoided him. Astrid herself seemed unaware of the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, filling page after page of her papers with calculations that grew increasingly complex and disturbing. She had begun creating what appeared to be probability matrices, tracking multiple variables simultaneously and generating predictions that extended weeks into the future. Ingrid found herself afraid to look at her daughter's papers, terrified of what calculations Astrid might be making about their own family or neighbors. The child who had once been her greatest joy had become a source of constant anxiety. Astrid's matter-of-fact discussions of human tragedy, her clinical observations about people's most private behaviors, and her mechanical processing of information that should have evoked emotional responses, all contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental had been lost or damaged in her daughter's mind. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late March. Astrid was sitting at her usual place by the parlor window, watching the street activity with her characteristic intensity, when she suddenly looked up at her mother with those calculating blue eyes. "Mama, there is something wrong with the pattern today." Ingrid, who was preparing dough for baking, felt her hands begin to tremble. "What do you mean, Astrid?" Astrid consulted her papers, flipping through pages of numerical notations with practiced efficiency. Every Tuesday for 12 weeks, Mrs. Anderson has walked to the parsonage at exactly 4:20. But today, she left her house at 3:47 and walked toward the lake instead. Her behavior indicates significant distress. Her step length decreased by 16%, and her breathing pattern was irregular. This suggests she is planning something final. The clinical way Astrid discussed Mrs. Anderson's apparent suicidal intentions, "Anderson is a good woman. She would never—" "The mathematical probability is 91%, Astrid interrupted with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. People who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while displaying physical signs of distress typically execute irreversible decisions within 3 hours of the pattern change. Mrs. Anderson's pattern changed 47 minutes ago." Ingrid felt the world tilting around her. The realization that her 12-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide with mathematical precision was more than she could bear. She dropped her bread dough and ran to find Lars, who was in their small shed behind the house trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of sharpening his mining tools. "Lars, you must come quickly. Astrid says Mrs. Anderson is going to harm herself. We must do something." Lars looked at his wife's terrified face and felt the familiar dread that had become their constant companion. They found Astrid still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her papers, as if recording a scientific observation rather than predicting a human tragedy. "Astrid, tell me exactly what you observed about Mrs. Anderson." Astrid looked up from her calculations. She deviated from her established Tuesday pattern by 33 minutes. Her physical indicators suggested severe emotional distress. Based on historical data about behavioral pattern disruption, the probability of self-harm is 91%, with peak likelihood occurring between 6 and 8 this evening. Lars made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his growing acceptance of Astrid's abilities. He left the house immediately and went searching for Greta Anderson, following the route toward the lake that Astrid had indicated. He found the elderly widow. "Mrs. Anderson," Lars called softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The elderly woman turned toward him, her eyes red with tears. "Lars, what are you doing here?" "I was concerned about you. You seem troubled lately." Mrs. Anderson's face crumpled. "I cannot bear it anymore, Lars. The shame, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone knows about my weakness. Pastor Olsen says it is sin, but I cannot help what I feel for him. Better to end it than to live with this disgrace." Lars realized with growing horror that Astrid's observations about Mrs. Anderson and Pastor Olsen had been accurate, and that the elderly woman was indeed contemplating suicide rather than face the scandal. He spent the next 2 hours talking Greta Anderson away from the lake, convincing her that shame was not worth dying for and that the community's judgment would eventually fade. When he returned home that evening, he found Astrid making final notations in her papers. "Mrs. Anderson did not follow through with her plan," she observed clinically. "The intervention changed the probability calculation. I will need to adjust my variables for future predictions involving third-party interference." Lars stared at his daughter in disbelief. Astrid had somehow observed and calculated a suicide attempt that had not yet occurred, and now she was treating his intervention as simply another data point to be incorporated into her mathematical models. The realization that his 12-year-old daughter was not just predicting tragic events, but studying human suffering with scientific detachment filled him with the horror he could not name. That night, as Astrid slept peacefully in her narrow bed, Lars and Ingrid made a decision that would change their lives forever. They could not continue living in Duluth. Astrid's abilities, whatever they were, had made their life in the Norwegian quarter impossible. But more troubling was the growing realization that their daughter was not just observing and calculating human behavior, but seemed to be losing touch with the emotional reality of the tragedies she predicted. They began making quiet plans to leave Minnesota, to find some place where Astrid could live without being feared, and where her unusual mind might find a different outlet. But Astrid was not finished with her calculations, and the most disturbing revelations were yet to come. As Lars lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the Norwegian quarter settling into sleep, he could not shake the feeling that his daughter's mathematical mind had uncovered secrets that went far deeper than adultery and suicide attempts. The precision of her observations, the clinical way she discussed human tragedy, and the growing complexity of her calculations all suggested that Astrid had been watching and recording far more than anyone realized. And the most terrifying part was that she was still calculating. The revelation that would expose the darkest secret of Duluth's Norwegian quarter came on the first day of April 1874. Astrid had been making increasingly complex calculations in her papers, creating elaborate charts that tracked the movements and behaviors of virtually every adult in their community. Her parents had begun packing their belongings in preparation for leaving Minnesota, hoping to escape before Astrid's next prediction could destroy more lives. But that morning, as spring sunlight streamed through their parlor window, Astrid made an announcement that would shake the very foundations of their community. "Papa," she said, looking up from her papers with those calculating blue eyes, "I need to show you something important. My calculations have revealed a pattern that explains everything." Lars, who had been dreading this moment for weeks, reluctantly sat down across from his daughter. Astrid opened her box to a section filled with detailed charts, maps, and numerical sequences that looked more like the work of a trained investigator than a 12-year-old child. "For 28 months, I have been observing and recording the behavior patterns of 47 adults in our community," Astrid began with her characteristic clinical precision. "Initially, I believed the patterns were random variations. But when I analyzed the data systematically, I discovered correlations that indicate organized criminal activity." Lars felt his blood run cold. "Astrid, what are you saying?" Astrid consulted her charts with the methodical precision of a mathematics professor. 8 men in our community have been meeting secretly every Thursday at midnight in the basement of Anderson's mining office. I calculated their movement patterns based on observed deviations from normal behavior, timing inconsistencies in their stated activities, and physical evidence of their gatherings. She pointed to a detailed map of the Norwegian quarter marked with symbols and measurements. Mr. Erickson tells his wife he works late on Thursday nights, but he leaves the smelter at exactly the same time as the other 7 men and walks to the mining office using a route that avoids the main streets. The pattern has been consistent for 28 months, with only 2 exceptions that correlated with illness or family emergencies. Lars stared at the map, recognizing the names Astrid had marked: Nils Hansen, Gunnar Andersen.
Astrid, how could you possibly know about secret meetings? I observe everything, Papa. Every night, every movement, every deviation from established patterns. Astrid turned to another page filled with numerical calculations. But the meetings are not the most significant discovery. My calculations indicate these 8 men have been involved in systematic theft from the mining operations, with estimated losses of approximately $52,000 over 28 months. Lars's hands began to tremble. The sum Astrid mentioned represented more money than most families in the Norwegian quarter would see in a lifetime. How could you calculate such a thing? Astrid's explanation was delivered with the same mathematical precision she applied to all her observations. I noticed discrepancies between the reported iron ore production figures and the actual output I calculated based on observed shipments, materials purchased, and waste disposal patterns. The difference indicated systematic theft, but I needed to identify the perpetrators. She pointed to detailed charts tracking the behavior patterns of the 8 men. These individuals all showed consistent patterns of increased spending that did not correlate with their reported incomes. Mr. Hansen purchased new mining equipment worth approximately $400. Mr. Erickson sent money to relatives in Norway. I observed him at the shipping office 14 times with packages too large for normal correspondence. The pattern was consistent across all 8 men. Lars realized he was looking at evidence of a criminal conspiracy that his 12-year-old daughter had uncovered through her obsessive observations and mathematical analysis. But Astrid was not finished with her revelations. The theft operation required inside knowledge of mining security and access to the financial records, Astrid continued. My calculations indicated the involvement of someone in management. The patterns pointed to Gunnar Andersen himself as the organizer of the theft ring. The final piece of Astrid's revelation hit Lars like a physical blow. Gunnar Andersen, the mining supervisor who had been gradually freezing them out of the community, was allegedly the mastermind of a major theft operation involving 8 men from their neighborhood. The precision of Astrid's analysis, the mathematical certainty of her conclusions, and the detailed evidence she had compiled through months of observation all pointed to a truth that was both incredible and terrifying. Astrid, these are very serious observations. The mathematical probability of them taking action against our family is 87%, with peak likelihood occurring within the next 96 hours. Lars understood that Astrid's final prediction was not about mine collapses or suicide or adultery, but about their own family's survival. Her mathematical mind had uncovered a truth that made their continued existence in Duluth impossible, and the men she had exposed would not hesitate to eliminate the one witness who could destroy them all. That evening, Lars made a decision that would save his family's life. Using the detailed evidence Astrid had compiled in her papers, he approached Dr. Hansen under cover of darkness and shared Astrid's discoveries. The physician, who had already been disturbed by Astrid's unusual abilities, was stunned by the mathematical precision of her criminal investigation. Lars, if what Astrid has calculated is true, we are looking at the largest theft operation in Duluth history.
Dr. Hansen whispered as he examined the papers by lamplight in his office. But more importantly, if Anderson suspects that Astrid knows, your family is in mortal danger. Dr. Hansen agreed to help them escape Duluth immediately. Using his medical connections, he arranged for Lars to receive an emergency job offer at an ironworks in distant Wisconsin, providing cover for their sudden departure. They would leave that very night before Astrid's 96-hour prediction could come to pass. As the Larsen family loaded their few belongings into Dr. Hansen's wagon under cover of darkness, Astrid made one final observation that would haunt Lars for the rest of his life. "Papa, in approximately 7 months, the theft operation will be discovered through other means. Mr. Anderson will face justice, but 4 of the 8 men will not survive the investigation."
The mathematical probabilities are quite clear. Lars shuddered as he lifted his daughter into the wagon. Even as they fled for their lives, Astrid was calculating the future consequences of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Her prediction would prove accurate in every detail. By winter, a federal investigation would expose the theft ring. Gunnar Anderson would be arrested and convicted, and 4 of his accomplices would die under suspicious circumstances that were never fully explained. But on that dark April night in 1874, as their wagon rolled through the sleeping streets of Duluth's Norwegian quarter, Lars could only think about how his daughter's extraordinary mathematical mind had both saved their lives and destroyed the only home they had ever known in America. The Larsen family vanished from Duluth in the early hours of April 2nd, 1874, leaving behind only whispered stories and unanswered questions. Dr. Hansen reported that they had received an emergency family summons back to Norway, but the few people who bothered to ask noted that no ship passenger records could be found to confirm their departure from America. What the residents of the Norwegian quarter never learned was that Lars, Ingrid, and Astrid Larsen had indeed traveled to Wisconsin, where Lars found work at an iron foundry in the town of La Crosse. Dr. Hansen had sworn to keep their locations secret, understanding that Astrid's mathematical abilities would always make her a target for those who feared exposure of their secrets. In La Crosse, the Larsen family attempted to build a new life far from the whispers and fears that had driven them from Duluth. Lars found the foundry work familiar and satisfying, while Ingrid slowly began to rebuild the domestic routines that had been shattered by Astrid's disturbing predictions. But Astrid herself remained unchanged. Her mathematical mind continued to observe, calculate, and record human behavior patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her both famous and feared. Dr. Hansen maintained correspondence with the family for several months, reporting that Astrid had begun working with a mathematics professor at a nearby university who was fascinated by her unusual abilities. The professor, a Norwegian immigrant named Dr. Erik Nordahl, approached Astrid's condition from a scientific rather than supernatural perspective, helping her understand and channel her observational skills in ways that might prove beneficial rather than destructive. But the most significant revelation came in December of 1874, when Dr. Hansen received a letter from Lars containing Astrid's final prediction about the Duluth theft operation. As she had calculated with mathematical precision, federal investigators had indeed uncovered Gunnar Anderson's conspiracy. Anderson was arrested and convicted of embezzling over $58,000 from multiple mining operations. Nils Hansen, who had been Anderson's primary accomplice, was found dead in his home under circumstances that were ruled a suicide, but which many suspected were something far more sinister. Otto Johansen and Herman Johansen also died within weeks of the investigation's conclusion. Johansen in what appeared to be a drunken accident, and Johansen from what Dr. Hansen diagnosed as a sudden heart attack that bore suspicious similarities to the symptoms of certain toxins. Astrid's mathematical analysis of the criminal conspiracy had been accurate in every detail, including her prediction that not all of the conspirators would survive the eventual discovery of their crime. The mining theft investigation brought unwelcome attention from federal authorities, but it also exposed a level of corruption that had been quietly damaging the community for years. New families moved into the houses left empty by death and departure, and the tight-knit community gradually rebuilt itself around more honest foundations. But the story of Astrid Larsen, the pale girl with the calculating blue eyes who could predict death and expose secrets through mathematical observation, became part of the neighborhood's whispered folklore. Parents used her story to warn their children about the dangers of knowing too much, while adults quietly wondered what other secrets might be hiding behind the ordinary facades of their neighbors' lives. Pastor Olsen, who had initially blessed Astrid's abilities as divine gifts, later confessed to Dr. Hansen that the girl's mathematical predictions had shaken his faith in ways he could not explain. The minister had begun to question whether some knowledge was too dangerous for human minds to possess, and whether Astrid's condition represented a blessing or a curse that had been visited upon their community. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Duluth's Norwegian quarter intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support the Holloway archives, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the most disturbing historical cases America has to offer. Dr. Hansen's final letter to the Larsen family was written in the spring of 1875, nearly a year after their departure from Duluth. In it, he reported that the Norwegian quarter had largely returned to normal, but that Astrid's story continued to circulate in whispers. He also shared a disturbing development that had emerged during the federal investigation of the mining theft. Government investigators had discovered that Astrid's papers, which Lars had left with Dr. Hansen as evidence, contained mathematical calculations that extended far beyond the immediate criminal conspiracy. Astrid had apparently been tracking and analyzing behavioral patterns throughout the entire Norwegian immigrant community, creating detailed profiles of dozens of families and predicting future events with remarkable accuracy. The federal investigators, trained in criminal analysis, were both impressed and disturbed by the sophistication of Astrid's observational methods. "Your daughter's mind works in ways that professional investigators might envy," Dr. Hansen wrote. "But I confess that I am grateful she is far from Duluth. The precision of her observations and the mathematical certainty of her predictions represent a kind of knowledge that I fear is too dangerous for any community to possess." The final mention of Astrid Larsen in any historical record comes from a brief notation in the La Crosse University Mathematics Department records from 1876. Professor Eric Nordahl reported that his special student had demonstrated unprecedented abilities in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction, but that her family had decided to relocate once again for personal reasons. After that entry, Astrid Larsen disappeared from history as completely as she had vanished from Duluth on that dark night in April of 1874. What happened to the girl who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision remains unknown. Some researchers have theorized that families possessing children with unusual abilities deliberately maintain their anonymity to protect themselves from both scientific exploitation and community persecution. Astrid's story represents one of the few documented cases where such abilities were recorded in sufficient detail to understand their scope and implications. This mystery shows us that the human mind remains one of our greatest enigmas, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that challenge our understanding of intelligence, observation, and prediction. In 1874, Astrid Larsen's mathematical approach to human behavior was seen as either divine or demonic.
But modern science recognizes that conditions like savant syndrome, autism spectrum disorders, and hyperthymesia can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think Astrid's abilities extended even further than what we discovered? Leave your comment below and let us know if you've ever encountered someone with similar extraordinary mental abilities. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to the Holloway Archives, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. These historical cases remind us that the most frightening truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right mind to calculate their terrible secrets. The case of Astrid Larsen demonstrates that sometimes the most terrifying discoveries come not from supernatural forces, but from the relentless application of mathematical logic to human behavior. In a world where we believe our secrets are safe, the existence of minds capable of such precise observation and calculation reminds us that privacy may be nothing more than an illusion, and that the patterns we think we hide may be visible to those who know how to look and how to count.